Okay, we should be back on. So let me officially welcome you to the Pig Practical Review live stream 2019. Ah, we're back. So let's see, the big day is coming up, day after tomorrow. I'm excited. I'm excited to do it. I'm excited to have it done. So I hope you guys are looking forward to that. It's a nice sort of culmination of all the hard work you've been doing, learning all about the parts of the pig and uh, of course, similar parts in us. So welcome to the live stream. So feel free whenever you're ready to go ahead and chime in with some questions, and I will try to chime in with some answers. Thanks for letting me know. I know I just haven't had time to change the title yet. I'll do that while I'm waiting for you guys to chime in with some questions here. How about we call this the Pig Practical Review 2019. That's all I need for that. Okay. I think that's all I need. Okay. Yeah, we got a couple questions coming in here, so we'll get those answered. And let's start with Amma. Oh, okay, I'm not sure who you are, but thank you for letting me know about the title. Got that fixed. Okay, Carmen is chiming in asking about lymph and the lymphatic system. Yeah, this is always very challenging for people. I would advise you to, if you can, look at a picture that shows lymphatic vessels sort of interspersed with our circulatory, with irregular blood vessels. Because I think you all have a pretty good mental picture of this idea of sort of the blood vessels coming out and all over your body, right? And you just have to intersperse that we also have these lymphatic vessels going out and all over our body, okay? That's a whole separate circulatory system. It's got its own, lymphatic arteries, veins, and capillaries. The key things to know is that the lymphatic system, like many systems, does actually do a number of different things. Okay, in terms of this fluid, it is doing a function that is more to support the circulatory system in the sense that it is recapturing the water that is squeezed out of the capillaries all around our body, but especially in places like our legs where water tends to pool. And if you didn't have a lymphatic system or it wasn't functioning very well, what would happen is essentially you would get a lot of water pooling in the tissues of your feet, and your feet and lower legs would get very swollen. And sometimes this happens just over the course of the day, and your feet are sort of swollen by the afternoon. I've heard it said that your feet are actually sort of like a half size bigger by the end of the day, and so you have to be careful when you try on shoes at the end of the day, right? But what's happening is all the time that water is then moving back into your lymphatic system. And that means that it's going into the fluid of these small capillaries. So from the tissues, and when I say tissues, I mean kind of like the spaces in between the cells, right? You're not wall-to-wall cells. You sort of have cells with all these little spaces in between. And the little spaces can get fluid in there. So the fluid goes out of those spaces into the lymph capillaries. It starts to travel around the lymphatic system with the rest of the lymph fluid. As it's traveling through, it's going to go to the different lymph organs, right? Just like vessels do, they go places. So it's going to go to the different lymph organs, whether that's your lymph node, probably be the first stop if it's down in your legs, or just simply your lymph nodes, and then maybe through some of the other lymph organs. On its way through, it's going to get filtered to some extent because the lymph nodes and the lymph organs are always looking for pathogens that are traveling in your lymph. And the lymph organs have a lot of white blood cells and ways to attack those pathogens. But the water itself is just going to keep on flowing, and the lymph vessels actually dead end in the vena cava and dump all that fluid in there. And it's okay if the fluid contains white blood cells and other things. It's, a lot of these substances and cells are in both blood and lymph. So a big difference is that your circulatory system is what we would call kind of a closed loop, right? The blood goes from your heart to your body back to your heart. The lymph is a little different because it has, the origin is sort of actually all of the tissues of your body where it picks up this fluid, then it sort of circulates it around, and at some point dumps a lot of the fluid back into the vena cava, right? So it's a little bit of a one-way trip in the sense of all this fluid that's in your tissues eventually ends up back in your vena cava. So you've already got two functions I mentioned, which is this idea of recapturing fluid that's gone to your tissues, that's leaked into your tissues from your bloodstream, and keeping that fluid out of your tissues and eventually getting it back into your blood. The second was that there is an immune function that has to do with filtering the lymph, checking for pathogens, and also storing white blood cells that can fight pathogens within the lymph organs. And there's a lot of white blood cells in the lymph fluid. And then the third one is somewhat unrelated, which is to transport fats, right? So it could be anything from fatty acids that diffused into the lacteals of your villi to some fat-soluble vitamins, things like that. And the background has to do with the fact that fats have to be carried sort of in a special way, because otherwise they would all sort of glom together and make big blobs of fat, right? And you can't really have that. So fat is sort of specially carried into the lymph, and some of it is in the blood, but even then it's usually in little carriers that sort of keep it from glomming together. So those are sort of the three main functions of the lymphatic system. Michael is asking about the difference between thymus tissue and thymus gland. I will tell you, we tend to refer to the two patches of tissue in the throat as thymus gland and the big one over the heart as the thymus tissue, but I don't believe that functionally there's much distinction. When I read about it in the physio book that I like in class, it really talks about the tissue in the neck being sort of continuous with the tissue over the heart, right? And keep in mind that we see a big blob, but all of the action is happening at the cellular level anyway. It's made up of cells that are doing things. So whether the cells are here or here doesn't really make that much difference. It's the cells that are secreting the hormone and directing the action of the T cells in the thymus, right? And this is true in organs all over your body. Some organs are more specialized, like your pancreas has specific cells that do endocrine function, and other cells that are in charge of the digestive function. But in some organs, it's a little more diffuse. If you think about your lungs, there's alveoli that fill your lungs. They're not specialized. They're all just lung tissue, right? And for the most part, your liver is fairly unspecialized as well, is my understanding. Okay, so a lot of times you have to get down to the cellular level to sort of think about what's going on in these organs. Okay, Anushka, do we need to know about the hormone triiodothyronine, which I can't even pronounce, T3, or just no thyroxine? Just no thyroxine. The thyroid hormones are quite complicated. They interconvert between one form and another. And if you ever do have to have your thyroid tested, it is useful to know that, because you can have different levels of the different thyroid hormones, and that can mean different things. But for our purposes, just understanding the basic function, just call them thyroxine and, understand the connection to metabolism, right? That's the important thing. Okay, Sachita's asking us to review the pancreas. So the pancreas is in two systems, completely in two systems, digestive, and those would be I believe they're the alpha cells of the pancreas, and those are secreting pancreatic enzymes, right? Just lots of enzymes that can break down different molecules that came in with your food. And in the same fluid, right, the pancreatic juice, in that same fluid is sodium bicarbonate, because you need that fluid to be basic, so that as soon as it encounters the chyme in the small intestine, which is very acidic coming out of the stomach, as soon as the pancreatic fluid hits the chyme, almost instantaneously, those two substances will neutralize, and that's going to protect the pancreatic enzymes that are in the fluid. Okay, and then those pancreatic enzymes can go on and digest all the different molecules, or at least many of them, that are coming in with your food. The other function is completely separate, and that's the beta cells in the pancreas producing insulin and glucagon, okay, which are the hormones that regulate blood sugar. And of course, insulin lowers your blood sugar when it's too high. Glucagon raises your blood sugar or blood glucose when it's too low. And those hormones are secreted into the bloodstream, because most hormones do their work by going through the bloodstream to different cells in your body and causing some kind of a response in those cells. In this case, to take in glucose from the blood, okay, uptake of glucose, and therefore to lower your blood glucose in the case of insulin, or in the case of glucagon, it actually tells cells, particularly in the liver, to break down the stored glucose, stored in the form of glycogen, and release those glucose monomers back into the blood. Okay, got a message from Krishma. I'm just going to mention this because I think it's funny, and we'll talk about this more later. Krishma sent a very reasonable question about the penis and the vagina and the systems. YouTube hit it, right? Because it has words like penis and vagina. Yeah, we'll talk about why that's problematic. So I'm going to show that. That's a perfectly fine message. And so Krishma's asking, are those structures in both the excretory and reproductive? So let's clarify that. Vagina is only in the reproductive, right? Because that's all the function that it has. It's used for intercourse and for the baby coming out, if there's a baby coming out. Okay. The penis is a little more complicated because in males, whether it's the pig or the human, the penis has inside of it the urethra, and in the urethra flows both urine, excretory, and semen, reproductive. Okay. I will tell you in common usage, if people say penis, they mean reproductive, right? If they're getting to the level of excretory, they're typically going to say the urethra, right? But in real life, of course, the urethra is inside the penis either way, no matter what it's carrying, right? So it's a little bit of a weird distinction. But I would say in general, if it's penis, I would probably say reproductive. If it's urethra, you could say either one, but I would say it's most commonly associated with the excretory system. I think largely because the urethra in the female is only excretory, and that may be why I think of it that way. Okay, Shruti's asking about the mesentery. So the same thing with the mesentery. It's one of these parts that is difficult to put into a system. And keep in mind, the idea of systems in itself is something we made up to help us organize the body, right? I mean, they do hold together in a sense that they're largely, the organs in a system are working together functionally, but some structures are working with multiple systems, and the mesentery is like that, right? It's a membrane that, yes, anatomically helps to hold, all the small intestine tubes to the base of the small intestine. But the part that we focused on in class, the sort of functional part besides holding, is that within that filmy layer are the capillaries and lacteals, I would imagine as well, that the nutrients are actually flowing through as they get absorbed through the walls of the small intestine. They're going to flow through those vessels and eventually go into a larger vein and be transported to the liver, okay, for various processing. Grace is asking the difference between B and T cells. Do they mature in different places? Yes, they do. So the letters stand for where they mature. So the T cells mature in the thymus, T for thymus. The B cells mature in the bone marrow. And I got asked a really good question in class a couple of weeks ago that I had never thought about before. I had to look it up because it was such a great question. So somebody asked how, if in the thymus, the T cells become immunocompetent in early childhood, right? Then how do you sort of ever get new T cells, right? And then sort of along with that was sort of how does that work with B cells? So I did some research on that, and the idea is that actually after early childhood, you don't really get new T cells, right? Because they are sort of done. However, the B cells can continue to be produced in the bone marrow and mature in the bone marrow, right? The B cells don't need to have so much of this immunocompetence thing. You guys don't know everything that happens in the immune system because it's really complicated, but the T cells actually run the show, okay? The T cells actually stimulate the B cells, okay, in ways that you don't need to know about right now. But once the T cells are immunocompetent, they can make everything else happen. And then as you go on in your life, the bone marrow can keep producing B cells, right? And those can go onto your spleen and other places, and the T cells will continue to sort of control what antigens are recognizable, and they will stimulate the right B cells. Okay, so hopefully that was not too confusing. Michael's going back to thyroxine. What does it do? So you have sort of the typical textbooky answer of regulate metabolism, but I'm going to suggest that you understand what that actually means. And metabolism, of course, can mean, virtually hundreds of things, right? You have many, many reactions in your body, chemical reactions of building things up and breaking things down that we would call metabolism. Ones that you guys have studied in class that you can relate to this is going to be things like cellular respiration, which is breaking down fuel. Protein synthesis, building new proteins, even cell division to some extent, building new cells. This is sort of like the work that your body's doing. So if you think of the thyroid as sort of producing thyroxine, and the thyroxine is a signal to sort of speed up that work, right? So you would actually potentially, with more thyroxine, speed up cellular respiration. You would also speed up things like protein synthesis and that sort of thing. So when people have an overactive or underactive thyroid, it actually affects many things. I tend to stress the part related to cellular respiration because I think it's easiest for you to relate to, and they're some of the most noticeable symptoms to people, right? So if people have an overactive thyroid, hyperthyroidism, then that's going to sort of ramp them up, right? So they will feel potentially sort of jittery and nervous, and because they're literally breaking down fuel faster, they would tend to lose weight, even if they're eating sort of the same amount of food. If you have a hypothyroidism, then that's an underactive thyroid, and you would slow down your functioning, okay? So in the case of cellular respiration, that means you would break down fuel more slowly, right? Which means you tend to feel kind of fatigued and tired from just sort of not getting enough fuel that you're breaking down. And you would also tend to gain weight even though you're eating the same amount of food, right? Because since you're not using the food, it's still in your body. You ate the food, it's not going anywhere. But since you're not breaking it down as fast, it's going to get stored as fat. Okay, so you're going to tend to gain weight if you have hypothyroidism. Trish is asking about UVR. So yes, that stands for urethra, vagina, rectum. Okay, and that's the order of the tubes from front to back, ventral to dorsal in the female's body. So when you're looking at the pig and they're lying on their back, you can literally see the three tubes, urethra on top, vagina underneath, rectum underneath that. And the urethra, of course, give you a side view, connected to the urinary bladder, vagina connected to the uterus, rectum connected to the inner rectum, and eventually the large intestine. Okay? Keep in mind, in the pig, the urethra and the vagina come together into a common tube, which goes to a common urogenital opening. In humans, those two tubes stay separate, right? So that in the closest to the front of the woman's body, okay, but it's sort of tucked in to the vulva, which is the sort of lips that make up the outer genitals on a woman, is the urethral opening, okay, where the urine would come out. Behind that is at the sort of back of that vulva area is going to be the vagina, okay, and that's going to go to the what we call the vaginal canal. And then behind that, a little more distance, is going to be the rectum with the opening, which is the anus, okay, in the very back. So you've got those three tubes with their three separate openings. So remember I gave you the hint that on the practical, you want to be able to describe the differences between a female human and a female pig, okay? That's really important that you walk away with that you have a very clear understanding of what female human bodies are like. Okay. Let's see, Ria's asking for the urethra, would the system be excretory or reproductive? I answered that a minute ago, but I'll just sort of emphasize that I would connect that with excretory, right? Even though in the male, the semen does come out of the urethra as well. But just to sort of keep things straight and clear, I would probably just call the urethra excretory. On top of which, the reality is you can only see it in the female in the pigs, right? In the female in the pigs, it's excretory. So I would stick with that. Michael's asking about if an organ has more than one system, do we have to memorize both or just one? First of all, I'd work on understanding it, not memorizing it, right? You know that. But I would focus on, most of the questions on the practical are only going to ask you for one system, okay? You should know both for the other written tests that we're going to have, but certainly at least one, you should feel super confident describing the function that goes with that system. I'm going to be honest, I don't remember if there's any that ask for more than one system. I know I do that in the group practicals sometimes, right? Because some of them are interesting in that they have more than one system. I don't actually recall at this moment whether the practical asks for that, right? Some of the more obvious ones would be like the pancreas, right? Because it has such distinct different functions in terms of endocrine and digestive. So some organs like that, yeah, like you should know that. the spleen, lymphatic and circulatory, right? There's some that are super obvious, but you don't need to reach for it, okay? Really, we're looking at sort of the major things that we've learned. Okay, Anushka, if the spleen is part of both the circulatory and lymphatic system, if so, what is the lymphatic function? So the lymphatic function, connect back to what I talked about at the beginning about what the lymphatic system does in general, right? The lymph fluid would actually go to the spleen, right? Inside of the spleen, and the spleen is a pretty major organ because it's big and it stores a lot of the white blood cells that are both what we call sort of the first responders that would sort of go out right away if there's a new pathogen coming in. And then it also, and those are terms like macrophages, if you've heard that term, but it also stores a lot of the white blood cells that can respond in a specific immune response. So if a pathogen comes in and cells like macrophages recognize it's pathogen, they will bring a piece of it back, a piece of the antigen back to the spleen and find the white blood cells that correspond with that antigen. And those white blood cells will multiply and multiply and multiply, and they will create millions upon millions of antibodies that match that particular specific antigen. Okay, so the spleen is sort of a major center of this immune response occurring. Okay, now that being said, it also has filtering lymph that comes through it. It also has major circulatory function in terms of storing blood products, recycling red blood cells. But again, you're going to remember that if you say lymphatic, describe the lymphatic function. If you say circulatory, describe the circulatory function. Okay, so I would practice both so that you feel comfortable with that. Okay, Hannah's asking mesentery. So I did just answer that, Hannah. Since it's a quick question, it doesn't fit well. It helps the digestive, but it has blood vessels. So you would just have to justify your answer in terms of coming up with a description that matches that system. Karishma, you're asking the urethra is only excretory because it only excretes urine, but it's in the penis on the male. Okay, so again, I've answered that one a couple of times. You can only see it in the pig on the female, and that means it's only putting urine out, and we would call it excretory. Okay, in the male, it is a bit more complicated. Ria's asking how you find a bunch of organs in the pig. So Ria, I think the first thing I'm going to say to that is you need to look at some pictures. I mean, I can just try to describe it in words, but you need to look at some pictures. Hopefully you've got some good pictures in your study guide. That was one of the main purposes of making those study guides. I would think you guys should be studying those in the next day or two. Vas deferens, you can look across the bladder or running to those scrotal sacs, the ureter, the white tube coming out of the kidney, going towards the bladder, and the larynx is going to be the bumpy hard part, right? That's sort of at the top of the respiratory tract in the throat, above the trachea. Sachita is asking the pathway of sperm through the epididymis and the testes. Okay, that is the pathway, so I'm not quite sure I understand your question. The sperm are originally produced in the testes, and then they gradually move through the epididymis where they're still maturing, and they might hang out there a little bit until they're either broken down or released during ejaculation. Okay, and in ejaculation, they quickly move through the vas deferens, join in with the semen, and they're released through the urethra, technically at the tip of the penis. Okay, Christian's asking, what's the difference between the scrotum and the scrotal sac? Okay, the scrotum is the part you can see on the outside of a male's body, right? So there's a sac hanging down outside the male's body that has skin, right? Inside of that are two testes that are actually suspended in those little scrotal sacs like you saw in the pig, okay? And those, remember, started on the inside and they descended down, and so they're in the scrotum on the outside of the body for temperature regulation, okay? So that would mean that there's a scrotal sac around each testis, right? And both of those scrotal sacs, or both testes, if it's easier to think about it that way, are sitting inside of the scrotum, which is suspended from the main part of the body. Ria's asking about the function of the epididymis. Just what I described, that the sperm, after they leave the testes, sort of move through those passageways. And you saw it was kind of a long passageway around the testis, each testis, right? And the sperm are still maturing, right? I'm not sure exactly, maybe growing their tails or something. I'm not sure which part of the process happens there. And there's some storage capacity in the sense that the testes are constantly producing sperm. So the epididymis also sort of has all these sperm in these processes of development, so that there's a little bit of a storage component as well in terms of a lot of sperm being in there. Daniel's asking about kidney functions and how it regulates the pH of the blood. So kidneys, do a number of different things. They're all related to managing the contents of the blood, right? Many of them are related to homeostasis. You want to be able to make that connection, right? By managing what's in the blood, the kidneys help to manage the conditions of the blood throughout the body, because all the blood goes through the kidneys pretty regularly, right? Every part of the blood is going to go through the kidneys multiple times per day. Off the top of my head, what's coming out my head, I don't know if this is right or not, it's like 45 minutes or something that every bit of blood makes it through the kidneys. Because remember, blood doesn't go directly to the kidneys on its way somewhere else, right? Blood just shoots out from the heart and comes back, and shoots out from the heart and comes back. But since it's all mixing together, eventually and all the contents of the blood are mixing together. So if you're thinking about something like urea, which is put out in all the cells of your body in varying amounts, right? The urea content of your blood sort of would gradually rise. And as the blood is circulated to your heart and shoots back out through your aorta to all the different cells, that blood is all mixed together so that the urea content of your blood is sort of all mixed together across your body. So as any blood goes through the kidney, it removes that urea, and then as that filtered blood comes back to the heart, it mixes in with blood that has more urea, and this level sort of is probably, I'm sure it fluctuates throughout the day, but it keeps the overall level of urea at a level that's not toxic. Okay, so the kidney, by coming in contact and filtering all the blood eventually through the course of time, is able to manage the level of urea, removing it, putting it in the urine, right? That's not so much homeostasis. That's just something it needs to do, right? I mean, it might be homeostasis in the sense of maintaining a certain level of urea, but I don't really think of that so much as homeostasis. But there's some very clear examples of homeostasis in the sense of things that can be higher or lower, like blood pressure, okay, pH, electrolyte level or osmotic balance, right? And so by moving around ions like hydrogen ions, hydroxide ions, the kidney can manage the pH level of the blood, or at least in part, because remember, your breathing also contributes to the pH level of the blood. So things that are really important, like pH or blood pressure, they're managed in multiple ways, right? But certainly the kidney contributes in a big way to the homeostasis of these major qualities of your blood, major conditions in your blood, okay? So blood pressure, one component of blood pressure is your blood volume, the literal liquid amount of blood that's circulating around. So that's influenced on one end by how much fluid you're taking in, right? How much you drink and how much water is in your food. And then on the kidney end, if the blood volume gets too high, literally too much volume of fluid, and that's raising your blood pressure because there's simply more fluid pushing against your arteries, then the kidney will reabsorb more water, right? Back into no, I'm sorry. Got to be careful with this, okay? If your blood volume is high, then the kidney is going to reabsorb less of that water, and a higher proportion of that water is going to come out in your urine to lower your blood volume, okay? If your blood volume is low, which would happen if you are dehydrated, you haven't been taking in enough water, and remember, you're losing water all the time. I mean, water evaporates out with your breath, right? Comes out as sweat. So you're always losing water. So if you don't drink water, you're gradually becoming dehydrated, even if you do nothing, right? So as your blood volume starts to decrease and your body and your kidneys know that you're dehydrated, they will start to reabsorb more water to conserve it, right? Put it back in the blood. You still need to get rid of urea, so your kidneys are going to continue to make urine, but the urine is going to be more concentrated, right? And you're going to see that darker yellow color as the kidneys get rid of other kinds of molecules that they still need to excrete in the urine, right? But there'll be less water in that urine. Okay. And I'm just going to look, I saw some other questions about kidneys, so let's take care of all those at once. So Grace says, are molecules like glucose actively transported back to the capillaries? I don't even think it's active. Because glucose moves by facilitated diffusion, I think it's passive. And I would have to look at a textbook because the movement of all these things back and forth does get quite complex. But if I had to sort of say off the top of my head, I think it's passive. Because I think once you have a higher concentration, it will move by facilitated diffusion back into the blood. And in fact, water is going to tend to follow that. And there's a lot of movement of molecules with water following that happens between your nephrons and your capillaries. You don't need to know all the details of that. Focus on the logic of where things need to go. That's really, at your level, plenty to understand, okay? So, you want to focus on the idea that we would want to keep glucose, right? We went to the trouble to eat it. We want to keep it. It's good fuel. So, generally speaking, glucose will come out in the filtrate, but it will be reabsorbed back into your blood, so that there should not be any glucose in your urine. If there is glucose in your urine, that may be a sign that you're diabetic because you have so much glucose in your blood, such high blood glucose, that the kidney is not able to reabsorb it effectively. It's sort of overflowing, right, in more casual terms, into your urine. Okay, so having glucose in your urine is potentially a sign of diabetes. And Grace is also asking about the hydrogen ions moving into the nephrons. It depends, Grace. They might be able to move passively. Sometimes the kidney is going to need to move ions actively, right, through active transport. And again, that's a level of detail that we really don't need to go into. But ions, if you think back to cell biology, ions can move passively through protein channels if it's high to low, and then they can be moved actively through proton pumps if it's low to high. So I think that both of those things are happening in your kidneys depending on the, on the conditions and what's going on. Michael's asking, are capillaries a part of the nephrons? No. Look at a picture in your book. You'll see that, the nephron has this sort of top part where the capillaries meet the nephron, and that's where all the fluid is being pushed from the capillaries into the nephron. But then the nephron is sort of a funny shaped tube, right? It has this long skinny part and comes back up. And then around that funny shaped tube, a bunch of capillaries are wrapping, so that there's a bunch of places where the capillaries and the nephrons are sort of side by side, and molecules can diffuse or be moved actively back and forth. And if you want a visual to make that clearer, there's some really pretty pictures in the PowerPoint and in your textbook, okay? But again, you guys really don't need to know the details of how all these things move. Just get a sense of what would move and why, okay? And of course, you do want to connect it back with ADH, okay? So briefly before somebody asks me, actually I see a question, okay? So ADH is a natural hormone we produce, anti-diuretic hormone. Go back to that word whenever you get confused. Diuretics are things that make you urinate more, like caffeine or alcohol. Anti-diuretic, therefore, means urinating less. Okay? So, urinating more means that the water is not being reabsorbed, it's going in your urine. Those are your only two choices. You reabsorb the water into your blood, or it goes out your urine. Okay? So, if I have a high blood volume, lots of water, I've been drinking lots of water, then I actually need to urinate more. And I'm not going to be secreting ADH. Okay? And not as much water will be reabsorbed. Water goes out in my urine. If I am becoming dehydrated and I need to conserve water, then ADH will be secreted. Okay? And that's going to tell the kidneys, reabsorb more water, anti-diuretic, not so much urine. Okay, we need to save this water, and less water will come out of the urine. Okay, so the normal function of ADH is to cause your kidneys to reabsorb more water, therefore conserving the water and having less water in your urine. Okay, alcohol blocks ADH, so it prevents this normal function of conserving water when you're dehydrated. So if you drink a lot of alcohol, even though you may be drinking a lot of fluid, if you're having a lot of big drinks, okay, you're telling your kidneys that, you don't need to conserve water, right? So the only other place for the water to go is in the urine. So when you drink alcohol, you tend to urinate more and lose the water, even if you're becoming dehydrated, because you've prevented the message that says you're becoming dehydrated. Hold on to the water. Okay? So just go back and forth and keep that straight and be able to explain it. But again, and I do this all the time still, I go back to the word antidiuretic hormone to remember what's happening. Okay? And Anushka, no, you do not need to know the individual parts of the nephrons. Sometimes I talk about the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule just to sort of explain about the filtrate, but I'm never going to test you on that. I'm just going to use the term nephron. Okay, that's fine. Okay, I'm going to go back up a bit because I skipped some questions to talk about kidneys. So there was a question about the levels of the hormones related to the menstrual cycle, FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone. As I mentioned in class, no, I do not expect you to know that. They fluctuate up and down during the cycle, and it's all very hard to remember. I don't remember it. I look it up if I need to know. You just need to know the major events in the menstrual cycle, which for our purposes is really ovulation, the egg being released, and menstruation, the lining of the uterus being released if the egg is not fertilized. Okay, those are for us the main components of the menstrual cycle that we need to worry about. You don't need to worry about how it happens. Okay, you do need to know that the estrogen itself and the progesterone is released by the ovaries. Okay, and that controls many different things, one of which is our menstrual cycle. Okay, and again we have one that was hidden because it has the word vagina. Okay, so Joy's asking the difference between the vagina and the uterus. Okay, so they're very different because the vagina is a tube, right? The uterus is more of a space. It's sort of vaguely triangular shaped. Okay, and remember in the pig, it's pretty darn tiny and it's kind of hidden under the bladder. So you could put the probe in there and see where the vagina does actually go to that tiny space that is slightly darker between the vagina and the fallopian tubes. Okay, so you could go by location and appearance. Pooja is asking about the pericardium, integumentary or circulatory. I would say it's like the mesentery, right? It's not easy to classify. You know, I would say structurally, like what it's made of, it's more integumentary, which is a system we didn't focus on, but it's all the membranes of your body, including your skin. So it's a membrane, right? But it certainly supports the circulatory system in terms of its role in protecting the heart and keeping it lubricated and that sort of thing. Ria's asking about gas exchange. So gas exchange is a term that's used to describe the movement of gas molecules that occurs in between the alveoli and the capillaries that are next to each alveoli. Okay, so there's a common theme here, right? There's blood and capillaries, and there's things next to it that can diffuse, whether you're talking about the villi, the alveoli, the nephrons, because all the action is happening at the cellular level where molecules can diffuse in and out of individual cells. In many cases from the blood and capillaries, but in this case from the air inside of these air sacs called the alveoli, right? So now we're talking specifically about gas molecules, okay, that can diffuse between the air inside the alveoli and the blood in the capillaries that are around the alveoli, okay? Keep the direction in mind. This is passive diffusion. Oxygen is going to move from high concentration to low concentration. Nothing's pushing it. But there will always be more oxygen in the air that we breathe in than in our blood because our cells are constantly using the oxygen in our blood. By the way, there's a higher concentration of oxygen in your blood than in the cells as the cells use it. So with us doing no work at all, the oxygen passively diffuses from the alveoli to the capillaries and from blood and capillaries all around the body into your cells, okay, from high to low concentration. At the same time, carbon dioxide is constantly being produced in your cells, which means it's passively diffusing from cells to capillaries into your blood. And yes, it undergoes a bunch of chemical reactions in there, right? And some of it is converted to carbonic acid, right, et cetera, et cetera. But there is dissolved carbon dioxide in your blood. And as that blood comes next to the alveoli, it will have a higher concentration of carbon dioxide than the air that's in those air sacs, because air from the outside has a very low concentration of carbon dioxide. Okay, so those carbon dioxide molecules will passively diffuse from the blood in the capillaries to the alveoli, really to the air in the alveoli, and be exhaled. Okay, Cindy is asking about the difference between endocrine and lymphatic function of the thymus. You can't really separate. I'm going to be honest with you. There's kind of no way to separate it because they aren't completely separate like it is in, say, the pancreas or something, right? The hormone that's secreted by the thymus, which is, think of it yourself, thymosin, Thymosin, okay? Thymosin is directing the lymphatic function. And I don't know the exact mechanism of this, but that hormone is actually causing the process of immunocompetence to occur. Okay, so I don't think you can separate those because if you say what is the function, right? It's to secrete thymosin, but it's for the thymosin to direct the process of immunocompetence occurring in the T cells, right? When you're very young. So it's hard to separate those in terms of the pig practical. Because those two are sort of intertwined, certainly I would accept both lymphatic or endocrine for the thymus. But you do need to talk about that full function. You need to talk about secreting thymosin because it's endocrine, but you need to talk about this idea of the directing this sort of development of immunocompetence in the T cells, right? Which again, the immunocompetence means the sort of process of determining which T cells will continue to be functional T cells. Okay, so some T cells will be eliminated because they match your own body tissues, right? So in the process of becoming immunocompetent, these T cells are sort of go through a process of elimination, right? Where the ones that shouldn't be there because they match your own body tissues are going to be eliminated, and then there's a sort of genetic mixing and matching to generate more possible combinations of T cells that might match outside foreign antigens. Okay, so that's a whole kind of complicated process. Hopefully when you're done, you've got a set of T cells that will respond to many foreign antigens and not respond to your own. Grace is asking about emphysema versus pneumonia. So what they have in common, of course, is they both affect your lungs. But they're quite different. Pneumonia is due to a pathogen, right? So you can have viral pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, and it literally is an infection that kind of gets all the way into the alveoli of your lungs, and so it can be a very serious infection. If it's bacterial pneumonia, we would fight it with antibiotics, right? Viral, that's tougher, okay? Emphysema is not due to a pathogen at all. It's literally physical damage to the alveoli, okay? And by far the most common cause of that is smoking cigarettes. And what happens is at the alveoli, we say that they lose elasticity, which is a way of saying stretchiness, right? So I use the analogy of a balloon. When there's a fresh balloon, it's like really stretchy, right? When there's an old balloon, like if you try to stretch it, it would almost tear, right? It's not very stretchy anymore, not very elastic. Well, your alveoli, they're not going to tear. They just simply won't open much, right? They're kind of more stiff. So even if your diaphragm does its job and the air should be moving in, the alveoli just hardly expand at all. So when you try to breathe, you barely get any volume of air into your alveoli, and there just isn't enough oxygen in that small volume of air to diffuse into your cells, right? And it's progressive, which means it gets worse and worse. It's irreversible, and it's very, very unpleasant to have because you feel constantly like you're not getting enough air. You're going to hurt a lot because when cells don't get enough oxygen, they hurt. Okay, so this is a very, very unpleasant thing to have. It's not curable. You can sort of delay it or prevent it by not smoking. But when you see people with oxygen tanks and the oxygen tubes up their nose, usually they're inhaling pure oxygen. Because if you can only get a tiny little bit of air in your lungs, you better have 100% oxygen so that at least you get better diffusion. Because remember, diffusion happens by concentration, or really by the concentration difference. So by having 100% oxygen in your alveoli, even if you just have a tiny bit, you've increased the concentration gradient between the air in the alveoli and your capillaries, and you're going to get a faster rate of diffusion. Okay? Boy, that's a nice concept for the final exam, right? We studied all the different things that affect the rate of diffusion. Things like surface area, having a bigger concentration gradient, right? Things like that. Okay, Michael is giving us some kind of a website that also got blocked. I don't know what it is. For some reason it got blocked, but it's there now. Karishma's asking, what is the function of the uterus if there isn't a fertilized egg? I mean, it doesn't necessarily do a lot, but it's not like it's going to go away, right? I mean, the uterus is a structure. It's going to be there regardless. But if you don't have a fertilized egg, I mean, if you're a human female, probably even any mammal, it's not doing nothing, right? Whether the egg gets fertilized or not, the uterus is responding to the hormones and it's going through the menstrual cycle, right? So whether the egg, we might go years without having the egg get fertilized, right? But every month, the uterus is going to thicken its lining, the lining is going to get released, right, in response to those hormones that are directing the menstrual cycle. So its function is to essentially be there and be ready if an egg should be fertilized in the fallopian tubes, so that when it's implanted in the wall of the uterus and the placenta starts to form and sort of, connect with the tissue that has a lot of capillaries in the wall of the uterus, that's ready to go, right? You don't want to be doing that like after the fact. So you want that process to be ready in case an egg should be fertilized, okay? So its function is to sort of be prepared for a fertilized egg if that should occur. So Daniel's asking, would it make sense to say blood goes in the nephrons from the capillaries and gets filtered and returned to the capillaries? No, I would actually not say it that way. Actually, I think that Michael was asking that. I would not say it that way because blood implies all of the blood. Blood does not pour into your nephrons, okay? That would imply everything, including your red blood cells, okay? When I picture the nephrons, okay, so here's my picture. Glomerulus, lots of capillaries, Bowman's capsule. Fluid being squeezed out. You know what I actually picture? This is all red. This is clear, okay, or very close to clear, maybe that yellowy color, because the red blood cells are staying in the capillaries. The fluid is being squeezed out into the nephron. So the fluid in the nephron is called filtrate, and it never contains red blood cells. So the fluid from your blood is pushed into the nephrons. That filtrate, that fluid that came pushed out of your blood, travels through the nephron, and then all kinds of molecules are moving back and forth, as we went over before. And then what's left of that fluid at the end becomes your urine. But blood never pours into your nephrons, okay? If you did, as a side note, happen to have blood in your urine, that's usually an indication that you've got a urinary tract infection. Okay, so that's not a normal thing. If you have blood in your urine, something's wrong, and you need to find out what's happening. And it's usually a UTI, a urinary tract infection, and a bad one at that. Let's see, Nissa, okay, I don't know you, but I'm happy to answer your question. Well, let's see if some other people have answered it correctly. So it says, what is urea? And Hannah said it is toxic nitrogenous waste resulting from the breakdown of amino acids. Perfect. Thank you, Hannah. And just to sort of clarify that, one of the things I explain to my classes is that your cells are constantly breaking down amino acids because they're constantly breaking down proteins. Your cells are constantly breaking down lots of things, including other cells, right? Because remember, you have like literally millions of blood cells, not blood cells, those too, but you have literally millions of cells a day that die and are broken down in your body because you're making new ones. And millions and gazillions of proteins that are broken down because they've done their job, right? And you don't recycle all of those amino acids. Some of them you do, but a lot of them, there's just too much and you're eating more. So you're going to go ahead and break those down. But because amino acids have nitrogen, unlike carbohydrates and fats, right? The amino acids have nitrogen, and it's just not so easy to get rid of the nitrogen. okay, it forms compounds that do become toxic if they get built up. So when they are converted to urea, that is what we call nitrogenous waste. And lots of animals have different ways of getting rid of nitrogenous waste. You have to get rid of it. And in our case, the urea is filtered out by the kidneys and is excreted with our urine. Okay, John Choi. I feel like I know who that is, and I can't remember right now. But hello. What are some factors that interfere with menstruation? Okay, interfere is a little vague, so I'm going to try to read some things into that. Let's see. Interfere. Well, the obvious thing is pregnancy, okay? If you get pregnant, you're going to stop menstruating, right? Because now you don't want to lose the uterine lining because it's attached to the placenta and the fetus, okay? So when a woman becomes pregnant, she stops having a period, right? During the time of the pregnancy, okay? And by the way, I'm trying to work on my inclusive language, so I'm just going to correct myself right there. When a person with a uterus becomes pregnant, because, you know, a trans man can have a uterus, okay? When a person with a uterus becomes pregnant, the menstrual cycle would stop for the duration of the pregnancy, and sometimes for a little while afterwards as well, until the hormones kind of get back on track. And that would interrupt the menstrual cycle. Many forms of birth control will interrupt or interfere with the menstrual cycle. And there's probably natural things in terms of people having, you know, issues with their hormones that might interfere with the menstrual cycle. If your question means something other than that, let me know, because I'm not quite sure what else to say to that one. And then we have a question about why is it that sometimes menstruation doesn't occur once a month? Yeah, a bunch of different reasons. Sometimes it's the hormones that aren't necessarily sort of going on this regular cycle, right? Sometimes the body's responding to problems. So if a person with a uterus is seriously underweight, is exercising a lot, sometimes just extreme stress, the body will essentially sort of like pause that whole cycle. Because if you think about it, you don't really want to get pregnant, right? If you're malnourished, if you're under a lot of stress, it's probably not a great time to get pregnant. So one of the things that happens in our body, in a person's body with a uterus, if they are underweight or having a lot of stress, is that their menstrual cycle might actually stop, right? And so it may not occur on that regular monthly basis. And then you have to add in the fact that lots of people with uteruses, it's just not a regular cycle. And especially with younger people, sometimes the cycle is fairly irregular, and there may be several weeks that goes by without a period, or sometimes you have a period in 2 weeks, right? And then for some people, not everybody, that stabilizes for quite a while. And then when women are approaching menopause, towards the end of that time, their menstrual cycle again will tend to become pretty irregular and maybe either be very short or very long, as those hormones sort of start to wane when estrogen starts to decrease, and then eventually that will stop. And again, that's when the menstrual cycle will stop for the rest of the person's life. Cindy's asking about the oracles. I want to say the oracles are not on the practical. Pretty sure. Okay, but just in case, can't remember. A lot of things in my brain right now. You've seen the oracles in the pig, right? They're literally these little pouches hanging right next to the atria, right? One next to the right atrium, one next to the left atrium. We call them little ears, okay? They're not as cute as these little ears. Those are very cute ears. Okay, but these little ears they actually have space inside, right? A lot of times they're kind of flat, but the blood that's going into the atria could actually go either way. There's actually kind of a Y there, and the blood could go into the atria, or it could actually fill up that auricle, and the auricle would sort of poof out if you could see it, right? And the idea is that the atria are tiny, okay? And as the blood is going into the atria and then the ventricles, if you were exercising, there would be a high volume of blood entering those atria really fast, right? And so the auricles could actually take in some of that extra blood and just increase the blood volume that's able to go into the atria, and then it would still eventually, as the heart contracts, I think it would also pump the blood from both the auricle and the atrium into the ventricle. Okay, so it basically is extra volume for blood entering the atrium. Okay, it's the pathway of urine from the kidney to the ureter, to the urinary bladder, to the urethra. Yes, you got it. Okay, yeah, thank you, Anushka. I didn't see a response, but that's a good one. Ria, what is the difference between the aorta and the descending aorta? It's location, right? So the aorta is a pretty big vessel, right? And you might want to look at a picture of this, but the aorta, as you've seen on the pig, comes from the left ventricle, but ultimately out of the top part of your heart, right? And then if you look at a picture, you'll see that the aorta literally curves around like this. This part's called the aortic arch, and there are some blood vessels that come out and, for example, go to the carotid vessels, carotid arteries going to our brain, or what are called the brachial arteries going to your arms. But then the big huge aorta, as it curves down, it goes down the middle of your body through your abdomen. Okay, and that part where it's going down through the middle of your body is called the descending aorta. Sometimes it's called the dorsal aorta, right, because it's toward the back. But I think the descending aorta is a nice description of how it sort of goes down, carries the blood down through your body, right? And the idea is, as it goes down through your abdomen, branches go to your, your different organs, like your kidneys, to your intestines, et cetera, and then eventually, as it gets down to the bottom of your torso, that entire artery is going to branch into the two femoral arteries that go into each leg. Okay. So you should be able to identify both, because on the practical, we could ask you either one. We could put the pin in the aorta that comes out of the heart, but we could also, as we showed you briefly on the thoracic dissection, we could sort of pull the lungs and sort of the internal organs to the side, and we could pin it where that descending aorta is going downward. Okay, and you would see the big white tube. It looks like a big blood vessel, right? So remember to use the appearance of things, right? I think people don't do that enough. Arteries look like arteries. They're big and fat and white and solid, right? As opposed to veins that are sort of baggy looking empty tubes, okay? Especially right now because there's nothing flowing through them, right? So tubes have a tendency to collapse if there's nothing in them unless there's something holding them open, right? So arteries have this very firm, smooth muscle holding them, making them sort of fat appearing, right? And the other thing that pops into my mind is the trachea. It doesn't collapse because it's got the rings of cartilage, okay? So if you can use these our brains are very visually oriented, right? If you can really have a picture in your mind of the appearance, what it looks like, where it is, what it's next to, that's really going to help you in terms of being accurate in your identification. Nis is asking about the mesentery. I did answer that earlier, so I'm going to give the sort of 15-second version here, which is that the mesentery is both the membrane that holds the tube. So if this is the tube of my small intestine, it's both the membrane that kind of holds all those clusters together, right, and kind of binds it together down here. But importantly for us, it's got the capillaries and the lacteals, so that the molecules that are being absorbed into the villi and into the capillaries of the villi move through these vessels as well into the veins and onto your liver, and eventually that blood goes to your heart. Okay. Wowee, I'm catching up with you guys. Okay, so it's a little after 9, so what I'll do is I'm going to call this last call. If you have additional questions, ask them in the next minute or two, and we'll cover those, and then we'll take a break so that we can go to sleep or get on with our evenings. Hopefully go to sleep soon. Okay, so we'll just hang out for a minute. Let's see, I'm going to remind you again while I'm waiting for some questions about some good general strategy. If there's terms you're concerned about, practice physically writing them, right? That's going to really give you some memory around what they look like on paper, not just in print. Like write them in your own handwriting so you have a sense of that. In fact, what I would do, make it as close to the practical as possible. Look at a picture, right? Look at a structure in the picture, write down the name of that term, right? And write down any terms that are associated with it, right? So for example, if it's, coronary artery, you might want to write down terms like, atherosclerosis comes to mind, right? So if there's terms that are somewhat difficult to spell, write those down. Okay, thymosin versus thyroxine, okay? Respiratory, not respiratory, right? So work on that spelling and writing as you study, and then get that visual of how those things look and how you would find them or how you would identify them in any pig. Okay, those are the two key things that you can do here. Oh, we got a few new people. Awesome. Okay, so identifying the pulmonary veins and artery. So first of all, we don't see the pulmonary veins on the pig. Okay, I've seen them on the bigger sheep hearts. They're behind, right? So the reason we don't bother trying to find them on the pigs, A, they're kind of small, and B, they would be sort of on the dorsal side of the heart, and it would be a hassle to see them. Okay, so we just don't. We see the other three. We see the pulmonary artery, the aorta, and the vena cava, but we don't bother to try to see the pulmonary veins. Okay, so don't worry about that one. Well, I wouldn't say don't worry at all, because it could come up in another question, right? So if we were to ask a pathway question about where blood goes, the answer could be pulmonary vein, but you're not going to be asked to identify it with a pin. Okay, for pulmonary artery, that's an easy one. It's the one on the top, the big fat one coming out at an angle from the right ventricle on the top. Underneath, aorta. Baggy one on the side, vena cava on the right. Pulmonary artery on the top, aorta, vena cava. Okay, just get that down. Will there be any questions on the lymphatic system for the pig practicals? Well, sure. There's a bunch of lymphatic organs, right? So I've already gone over in this live stream the thymus and the spleen. Those are both lymphatic organs, right? So you could say lymphatic system and describe what they do in that system. Welcome, Shalini. Haven't heard from you yet. What's the difference between the renal vein and the renal artery, location-wise? Which one is on top? Oh my gosh, we don't identify those in the pig anymore. You know, the funny thing is I think I just saw my little post-it note about that I used to refer to in years past. I want to say it said that renal vein was on the top, but I don't really remember. If I was looking at the pig, I would try to tell by appearance, because veins and arteries look different, as I mentioned. But honestly, those aren't terms that you need to know. You should have some idea functionally that oxygenated blood from the renal artery is going into the kidney. Deoxygenated blood is coming out, because as blood goes through the kidneys, guess what? Oxygen is diffusing into the tissue of the kidney, because the tissue of the kidney is doing work. It needs oxygen. Okay, so functionally you should have an idea of it just in terms of arteries and veins, but you're not going to have to identify it. Okay, so don't worry about that. And if you're really curious, you could look in a physiology book. Anushka's asking about identifying the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay, you know, you can vaguely see it. You can see it sort of on the back of the stomach as it goes into the diaphragm. It's not, I will tell you right now, it's not something we're going to put a pin in. It is somewhat difficult to see. The pyloric sphincter actually usually jumps out at you. You can see this sort of big bulge right where the stomach joins the small intestine. But because of the location of the lower esophageal sphincter, kind of between the stomach and sort of squished in between the stomach and the diaphragm, it's harder to identify. Usually if I want to know where it is, I feel with my fingers and I can feel the bump, but it is not something we're going to stick a pin in and identify. Grace was asking about the practice practical, and the pin was pointing to the pulmonary artery, but the aorta wasn't shown. Can you tell which is which? Yes, you can, right? Because the pulmonary artery is on top, right? So as long as we haven't like dismantled the heart, and we're not planning to do that, if there's a big fat one coming out of the ventral surface of the heart, that's the pulmonary artery, okay? If we're pinning the other one, you're going to see the pulmonary artery on top of it, right? So that's how you're going to know. We're not going to take any arteries out, okay? And that would be very confusing. The renal artery connects to the aorta, and the renal vein comes from the inferior vena cava. Okay, I would probably just change your language there slightly, to be honest, because logically, think of blood flow. I'm going to change your language to say the renal artery branches off of the aorta, because the blood starts in the aorta and goes to the two renal arteries that go to each kidney. And then you said the renal vein comes from the vena cava. I would say the renal vein goes back to the vena cava, right? So I think it is helpful to keep that language in mind because you really want this strong idea, arteries going away, and ultimately, I'm trying to think if there's any exception to this. Okay, other than the pulmonary artery, all systemic arteries are going to branch off of the aorta. Okay, all veins are coming from capillaries all around your body, which go into venules, and all those veins return back to either the inferior vena cava if they're from below your heart, or the superior vena cava if they're coming from above your heart. Okay, but they're coming back to the vena cava. Oh, that's interesting. Andy's making the point that you could sort of tell which side of the heart the blood vessels are connected to. Yeah, that's a bit confusing because remember that really, even though the pulmonary artery and the aorta are coming out of the top of the heart, they're really coming from the ventricles. It's just a three-dimensional object, and so the vessel is going up through the middle of the heart where you can't see it and popping out the top. Okay? You can see the angle. So if you think about the pulmonary, remember the heart's kind of tilted like this, right? The cat just threw this ball in the air, caught my eye. The pulmonary artery is like this because it's coming from the right ventricle. This is my right arm, right? So the pulmonary artery ultimately is coming from the right side of the heart. You can see that with the angle. And since the heart is kind of tilted, the fact that the aorta looks more straight up and down, if you actually follow the angle, it's going right towards the left ventricle. So you can use that to some extent. That would be another strategy that you could use. Okay. So again, I've gotten to the end of the questions. So I'm going to start to sort of do some closure here, unless anything else vital comes through. Okay, and I'm just going to remind you all that, there is a lot to remember. Going through this process, redoing it is helping to ingrain it in your brain, which is good because a lot of this is going to reappear on the final in 3 weeks. Okay, so don't feel like I'm going to memorize this in the next 2 days and it's going to go away forever. You are going to need it for the final. Okay, so try to really learn it, put it together in your mind, make connections with things that you know to try to get that ingrained and practice. Okay, but do realize that there is some recall and some memory involved here, right? So memory works best when you've had enough sleep. So I would say as soon as this live stream is over, wrap up whatever other vital things you have to do this evening. Try to get to bed in the next little bit. Plan ahead for tomorrow night so you can get to bed at a decent hour and feel rested, okay, before the practical on Friday. Eat some food in the morning. Hungry, dehydrated, not good for your thinking, okay? So depending on the time of day that you are taking the practical, think breakfast, think brunch, think lunch, think a good amount of water, but maybe not right before the practical so that you can go to the bathroom and not have to go during the practical. Okay, so those are some good body tips. So I think we're going to call that it for this evening. Really appreciate you guys tuning in, and I hope it was helpful to you. I'm looking forward to having you all do awesomely on the practical. I know you will. And then I guess I am kind of looking forward to being done with the pigs for this year and moving on. Okay, so do your best, feel confident. I think you know a lot of stuff. I'm really proud of all the hard work you've put in. You should be proud of yourselves. So take care of yourselves, and I will see you all either tomorrow or Friday. Take care and have a good night.